Hi, this is Bill. Yes, I've logged in on the computer and I can see the video here now. I can see your potential historic resources white screen. I'm calling in, so my voice will come through the telephone, but I can see what you're showing.
Okay, fantastic. Just wanted to check and make sure that you'd be able to kind of follow what we were talking about. So I wanted to start just talking about the criteria applied when our consultant did his survey. There's a lot of text on this slide. I apologize, but you don't need to read it right now. I'm just going to start by doing a little bit of a verbal presentation. So our historic resources consultant, Jerry Takano, went out and actually did a walking survey, came into town and walked the district. And he applied the 4 criteria on the left here, which are the 4 criteria currently adopted in our historical preservation element. And they're pretty typical, I would say, from my experience with state, national, and local criteria for considering significance. They're pretty run-of-the-mill. And with the application of those criteria, in his subjective opinion as an expert, historic resources expert, he created a list for us. So the subcommittee went through that original list and had a conversation about how do we further vet this and potentially apply slightly more stringent criteria with the intent of capturing the best of the best, the things that we really want to see preserved, with the intent of trying to really balance priorities in the community, both for giving property owners rights to future development, obviously meeting our need to make this a plan that will support future housing development, but also retain some of the most beautiful and unique characteristics of our city that we've worked so hard to protect for so many years. So with that in mind, we had discussed potentially trying to further clarify some of these sort of more generic criteria by tying them back to some of the content that is identified in our context statement and in our historical preservation element, specifically related to the architectural eras that have been identified through Susie Van Kirk's work and through adoption by the council as significant for sort of the story of development in the city. And that's the 4 here on the right: settlement, Victorian, transitional, and craftsman. And all 4 of those types are seen in the identified resources, potential historic resources that are coming before you tonight. And we also wanted to try and make a clearer tie to specific social and cultural development that is identified specifically in our context statement. I think that our consultant had, a little bit of a hard time. He kind of cast a very wide net intentionally because some of the things were not necessarily information that he had specific local knowledge on. And that was where the subcommittee, and hopefully this committee as well, will come in applying sort of a local context in these local kind of historic pieces. And this last item here, if a structure is of unusual or special design character, we basically left that one unchanged. That is often sort of the aesthetic value of a structure is often what sets it apart, especially for folks in the community that might not have a lot of historic training. And we didn't really see a need to further refine that one. But all of these suggested refinements are still in draft form. So there will be opportunity to continue to alter them over time. The intent, again, was purely to try and take a very wide cast net and refine it down to a list that the committee would feel comfortable with, hopefully the community will feel comfortable with, and then the planning commission and council will feel like they have pretty broad support for ultimately adopting. And as a reminder, the work that we're going to do, it sounds like over the next few meetings, will purely be a recommendation to the planning commission and to the city council. It's not going to automatically change the process for any structure, and it's the council that will ultimately be required to do that policy balancing and really take all different perspectives of their constituents in mind. So don't be too afraid to really rep historic pres. That's why you're here. And we acknowledge that it's going to continue to be an iterative process. So this is the other slide with a lot of text, and you don't need to read all of it, but the intent again was to try and consider how could we further refine existing criteria beyond these four sort of topic types. We had talked about, well, if a structure, is clearly a settlement structure from one of these four identified periods in the city's history, how many other similar structures of that type exist in the district, exist in the city? If there are dozens and dozens, maybe we can be a little bit more picky in the ones that we decide to ultimately identify on this list, because there are so many other examples that we can really go for the cream of the crop. On the other hand, if there is a style, an architectural style that isn't very commonly represented in the city, like the stucco building that you guys saw a couple of meetings ago in the Bayview neighborhood conservation area, that could also be something to consider. It's, general unusualness for our part of California. And then condition, integrity, quality of significance all kind of speak to, how well can it convey the story that it's trying to tell? Is it in good condition? Has it been altered? Does it still have original windows, original siding? Have there been clear alterations to the structure? And if some of those things have really sort of muddied the original structure, taking that into account as well, and trying again to really only capture properties that have been truly excellently maintained and really clearly tell a story about an important part of the development of the city. So all of that as kind of a preamble, just to kind of set the stage for the lens that, at least on the subcommittee, we discussed in undergoing this review, particularly for Alex and Bill, who are not part of that conversation. Do you have any questions, any thoughts on this? Does this make sense to you? Or would you like to see us take this in a slightly different direction? Well, I don't see. Hello.
Hi, this is Bill. No, I have no comment at this time.
Okay, thank you, Bill. Alex, I see you've unmuted as well. Do you have any thoughts?
No. Well, I have a question, but it's not until you get further along.
Okay, well, feel free to interrupt me at any time. I may or may not be able to see you if you have unmuted and want to speak. So feel free to jump in and ask me questions. I will not consider it rude. Okay, so moving forward to the kind of preliminary review where we can actually talk through sites. We have about 20 sites to go through, and about half of them, nearly half, about 40%, were actually identified already in Susie Van Kirk's 1979 survey, but for whatever reason, they have not yet been landmarked. That's likely due to a lack of interest from a previous or present property owner, or it may simply be that we haven't provided enough information about that process in recent years. Any existing landmark properties that were captured in this survey have already been removed from the list because their process will not change in any way. We are already considering them historically significant. There's no potential about it. And when projects that would alter a structure that is landmark come forward, we have a very clear process for how to manage that. So the intent of this, again, is purely to ensure that we have as consistent a process for other sites that are potentially significant as we do for ones that are already landmarked, and that those sites hopefully are, eligible for the positive pieces of owning a historic property as well. Okay, so again, this list, whatever list is ultimately recommended by the committee, will go before the Planning Commission and the City Council. It will not immediately change any procedure. It will purely be a recommendation from you guys as sort of the historic experts that advise the council in the decisions that they make. So I broke this up into 3 sections to make it slightly more bite-sized. The first section is special cases. These are some sites that the subcommittee talked about in a little bit more detail and had some questions for the broader committee about, you know, how to handle. So without further ado, let's jump right in. Okay. So I'm hoping this one will be a good place to start because there is already a pretty good precedent for how to manage these structures. The historic survey identified the other 3 Devlin cottages on the block as potentially historically significant. They all are, you know, from the same development era. They all were developed at the same time. They have similar styles. The fact that there are 4 of them together kind of gives them a special feel. And as it says here on the slide, the one on the far west side actually is an existing landmark structure. So in the past, it was found to contain enough significance to protect and guide future development on that site. And I believe those property owners are with us here tonight. So thank you for joining us.
I just want to interrupt for a second.
Sure.
So this, you could think of this as also the first subdivision in Arcata, or we have this one, the Devlin Cottages, then you go over to the Wagner block. And so those are like the first 2 developments in Arcata before you got into, you know, Sunnybray and Sunset, all of that. But this sort of follows that context. If someone built 4 cottages, they aren't identical, but they're really close. The Wagner block has the same thing. They have some that are pretty identical, some that aren't. But I just wanted to mention that.
Yeah, thank you. And the HSU Special Collections Library, I didn't pull them for today, but maybe next meeting I will bring them, has some actually really phenomenal photos of the barrel factory and the creamery building with these 4 houses built out. And, you know, it's definitely, it was pretty powerful then, and has retained a fair amount of significance. So this is the first series of sites that I thought would make sense to just bundle through. They all kind of have the same story. And so I will turn it over to the committee for any initial thoughts or comments in addition to what Alex has shared.
Well, I don't have any problems with these. I mean, we've always felt like, well, it's some, you know, we've always felt like in the historic community or the Historical Site Society that they're very significant. They're transitional, but they're like Victorian cottages. They have a lot of details and they're very important. And I know that they're across the street from the gas place. So they aren't in the best location to enjoy them because there's not anything across the street that would emulate them in any way. But they're very significant, all 4 of them.
Bill or Tim, do you have any thoughts to share?
I just concur with that assessment. I mean, I think the photos kind of speak for themselves here. Kind of the integrity is fairly well retained, at least you can tell from the photos anyways. And and obviously they fit the criteria that we're talking about in terms of periods of significance. So.
Bill, any thoughts from your end before we move on to the next sites?
Well, I agree with what's been said, but I'm curious on context of this final sentence here. 1 of the 4 is currently landmarked. Why is that? Were the other 3 proposed at one point, accepted, or were they just?
No, the one that's landmarked is because it's owned. They're on this call, and in order to put a restaurant in there, I think they had to become landmarked. They could clarify that for you.
Yeah, my understanding is it was voluntary. All landmark designations at this point in time are voluntary, and the property owners came forward with an intent of protecting their resource.
I see.
Okay, well, moving right along, and if the property owners would like to speak on this after we wrap up the discussion, we can turn it back over and I'll try and make sure that we get time for them to speak on their experience if they would like to. So these ones were kind of a maybe for the subcommittee because the consideration was, would either of these structures, the purple structure or the yellow structure, be considered particularly significant in a local context because of Haliashi as a business in the creamery area. Without that additional context, my understanding is the subcommittee was more leaning in the direction of not considering them particularly significant based purely on the architecture, but wanted to at least bring it to the full committee to have a discussion about whether or not that additional context would kick them into the category of potentially historic.
I think we were also talking about, particularly the Purple House, that we were uncertain if that was moved to that location from another spot. I think we discussed that. We weren't sure about that.
Right, I remember you had brought that up. Yeah, Alex, do you have any memory of?
No, I don't have any, and possibly maybe they would know at Haliashi. They might have an idea because they've always maintained that house and made sure it's been one thing or another. I remember when it was a button place. As far as I remember, it's been there for a long, long time. But you have Haliashi is a new building on the property.
Right, so it's not like necessarily these structures were the original location of Haliashi as a business, is that?
Well, Haliashi was never in that building. Is that
Right.
maybe I misunderstood what you said? Haliashi started in a garage off of Union Street on 12th Street, I think is where they began. And then, but we don't know. We'd have to do a lot of research to find out. There may be more than that cottages along this area because it was a lumber company. I can't think of the name of it right now that was operating in this area. So you have houses that are on 10th Street. Dobie Class lives in one of them, and they were all built by, I think it was the Loud or something like that, lumber company, and they built all those houses for their workers. So we don't know how this fits into all of that without research.
Yeah. I guess when we were doing the subcommittee meeting, I maybe missed the significance of Haliashi. I don't think that Haliashi has bearing on the historic nature of these buildings. I think the yellow building was probably moved there after the fact. And the pink building, during our subcommittee meeting, I found that pink building on aerial images from pretty far back in the day. I don't remember exactly what the date was, but I think we considered that to be, sort of an original building built in that place. So we could do some additional research on that if the committee, ultimately decides to lean towards,
Well, I
historic
guess
on that site.
this is the question, I think, David, in some senses. Our goal here is to identify structures that meet the criteria as set forth, the 4 criteria. And, and I'm not sure, and so we're mostly focusing on the architectural qualities of these structures as opposed to their history, essentially. And that's probably why you don't see any of the structures noted as meeting, let's say, what is the criteria, the social history criteria. Is it number 3, I think? That's probably why that is, because that's a research topic, essentially, to dig in and, who was living there, was somebody important associated with this or something like that. So, that's always going to be a weakness, I think, of this list of identifying social history focused items, I think.
No, I agree. And I think that part of the rationale from, early discussions amongst the committee members was that, the social history, while it's not known, is conveyed in the integrity and significance of the resource that remains. And I think you could probably, put on one end of the spectrum, the town of Bodie, many of those structures are, in pretty poor condition. The Park Service is doing the best they can to maintain them and preserve them. And I think if the town of Bodie was in a place like Humboldt, where it rains as much as it does, probably wouldn't be in as good as condition as it is. But so that's one end of the spectrum. I think on the other end of this, but that town of Bodie also has a lot of context. Like you walk through it, and it's like the entire town conveys meaning. So I think you're absolutely right, and we're really going to be left to do these structures, retain architectural features. I mean, Jill's not here, but I'd hazard a guess that shed roof on the porch is probably not original. So some folks might be able to weigh in as to whether this structure has integrity, regardless of it's the length of time it's been standing in this location, or its social history, what it conveys from social history. So I think you're right. That is going to be a limitation, but I think this is the best we can do to take a first big step towards providing some certainty around this issue and ensuring that we can preserve some of the important at least architectural resources that we still have.
Well, it's that shed roof it was probably a small gable over the front door originally, and somebody came along later and did this, but it's reversible. It's not, those are all fixable things. And when you're doing rehab, those are the things you get in and you bring them back to the way they were, or the way you thought they were anyway, what you believed.
Yeah, that's a great point.
Or what your research came up with.
Bill, do you have any thoughts on this one, these two? Okay.
I might suggest that committee members go ahead and jump in and voice their thoughts if they have them, but we might, because we don't have enough to really have the discussion around the process, the voting process and that sort of thing, maybe we should just go through the material so that the committee members who aren't here can come back and take a look at it, and then when we have the full committee here, we can start having that more detailed and robust conversation. That'll also save a little bit more time for people in the public to present their thoughts, recognizing that in 45 minutes this meeting is ending.
So you have to remember that Haliashi is a new building. Across the way is a new building next to this, where the child care people, whatever their organization is, that's a new building. It was built by Haliashi. So I have a feeling if we went back and asked Haliashi when they got into building all these buildings, what was standing there? Was this in this location? I'm sure they have that information because they built 2 buildings on this property. Mm-hmm. So that's where I would go to find out more information.
I have no specific comment, but one question. The buildings we're looking at now, they're on the table that you've sent out to us. Those are ones that the subcommittee has put forward, or did Jerry, is this the work of Jerry's walking survey? I was just confused on that.
Yeah, good question. So Jerry originally sent a list. If there were sites that the subcommittee felt were clearly not in good condition or sort of outside of the scope of what we'd be looking for in the survey, they were not brought before you. There were a handful like these 2 where the subcommittee said, this one could kind of go either way. We'd like to get the full committee's perspective on this, as opposed to making a determination without letting there be more of a discussion about it.
I see.
So there are a few that aren't necessarily, recommended per se by the subcommittee, but are being offered up for further discussion and may ultimately not be considered meeting threshold for significance that we choose to apply. So I guess I'll kind of just speed through the next few, but again, if you do have any burning thoughts, please do stop me. So this is the last one that's sort of, a unique case. My understanding is Caltrans has already surveyed and identified the rail line here. And so I don't know if we need to really discuss it further. But this one also is something that we discussed a bit as the subcommittee. And Tim, I don't know if you would like to speak to it at all.
Sure. What this is a spur line off the Northwest Pacific Railroad. And essentially that railroad system, the whole Northwest Pacific Railroad line all through Northern California, has been determined eligible for the National Register already. So basically what that means is that if there was a need to alter or remove this line, the rail line going through, basically someone would have to consider, does this line going through town contribute to the eligibility of the Northwest Pacific Railroad as a whole? Okay, and if it did, if it was determined it did, and it was to be impacted, then there'd have to be some sort of mitigation associated with the alteration or removal. So.
Perfect. Yeah. So I feel like that one, it doesn't necessarily need much more, discussion from the committee, but it was identified by our sub-consultant. So I wanted to add that in here. So the next batch is the sites that Susie Van Kirk did the research on, made sure that she had kind of done her due diligence for both the context and the architecture, but were for whatever reason not ultimately landmarked. So the first one is Portuguese Hall. I feel like this one has a pretty clear sense of local history and context without really even needing to go inside. It says Portuguese Hall on it. If anybody has, been inside, attended one of their Linguiça breakfasts, you know that it still is a very active and thriving part of our community. So that is the first of these Susie Van Kirk's. The Murata House, which currently houses duchies, was another one, kind of a unique style for the area, in my not expert opinion, but we don't see a lot of structures in town looking like this. And there are a lot of elements of it that have been retained. The lumberyard office is an interesting one. Susie Van Kirk identified it, as did our consultant. Our consultant in his notes mentioned that the neighboring workshop building may also be of interest. That one, I would assume, would not really meet the eligibility criteria due to its condition. But that, would definitely be something for the subcommittee to discuss and make a determination on. If anyone has any thoughts on that before I move on.
And I think what the thought is there, that the other structures contributes to the significance of the smaller structure. But that's not what we're considering here, is the point. We're considering things individually. So I don't know if that statement applies in any sense.
Yeah. And then the Lord House, I think this may be the last or second to last property that has been identified in the past by Susie Van Kirk, is very beautifully maintained, but is not currently a landmark property. And I know we have had some, very brief discussions at this committee about the history of this site. I agree with David. We need to make sure that we are carrying the property owners along with us for some of the sites that do have history like this one does. But so that's the end of that batch. I don't know if there are just sort of any initial thoughts, reflections from the committee about capturing sites that have already been identified, or if we should wait for the full committee to dig into that in more detail.
I just have one question. The railroad, with the Gateway project, is there any proposals to affect that railroad, especially the crossing on Samoa, on 255?
Yeah, the rail goes down L Street, which is proposed in the plan as the second part of a one-way couplet between K and L Street to segregate northbound and southbound traffic. If you're interested in looking at what that looks like, I can bring that up. But it is proposed to have some modifications through that section of it. And I agree with Tim that we're gonna have to do that analysis and identify, suitable mitigation measures if that project does go forward, or when that project goes forward, as the case may be.
That seems like the mitigation would be fairly straightforward if you just wanted to assume eligibility, where you just basically interpret it essentially. Why is there a railroad line running through town? That's a great question people ask. So.
Mm-hmm.
Well, across from this, the Lord House, right in that vicinity, I don't think I'm too far off, is where the car wash is, but that's where the train station was originally.
And this committee had spent some time discussing an interpretive panel in that general vicinity. That sounds like that could be a discussion we have again.
And the
That would
Lord
be
House
great, yeah.
is one of two two-story Italianate houses in Arcata.
Yeah. So so there aren't necessarily, it's not a dime a dozen. And so that would definitely fall into the criteria of, abundance or uniqueness.
The other thing is, it was a trend in Arcata to, if people had front yards, is to build in them. And that was I would say that was happening probably in the 60s, maybe 50s, 60s, and it definitely went into the 70s. That's why you have in front of the Devlin House 2 units.
Mm-hmm.
That's why you have these units here. But the property owners, a few years back, moved the one on the east side back so you would have a view of the Lord House. Before that, you really couldn't see it because it was right up towards the sidewalk. So they made that accommodation and actually moved that whole unit on the right-hand side. And then they put grass in and walkways and fencing and etc. So they did an upgrade there to make it available. And you have I'm not going to be able to give you the name right now, but it's up on I Street and maybe 14th. And I want to call it the Chapman House. But that is a house that there's another house built in the front yard, but it was a house that had a whole front yard and a whole backyard. And someone bought off part of the property and built a house in front. But we used to have where you would have a settlement or a house, and you no longer needed the side yard because you could buy milk and you didn't have to grow all your vegetables and have your chickens, and they sold it off. And you see that all over Eureka, where all of a sudden you have a Craftsman house or you have a Victorian house, something right next to a settlement or a house. And that's because that was the trend that happened.
Mm-hmm.
So
yeah, the original infill.
yep.
Okay, so moving on to the third and final set of properties. So there are, I believe, 8 of these. So it's the largest category. These are sites that are historic resource professional identified, in addition to sites that we already had a pretty clear sense of. Some of these, the subcommittee felt pretty confident should be included. Some they were not as sure about and wanted to have a discussion with the full committee. So this is a good example of a site that the subcommittee was not confident about, wanted to discuss with the full committee, see what the perspective was on it. It looks like there have been some things that may have compromised it, but it is definitely within the periods of significance. This one is right by the tire shop if you're coming off Samoa, coming up into town on G Street. And it's a nice, nice example of its style. Looks like it does maybe have an addition, but generally pretty well maintained. This is another one where there have been some alterations that could be considered pretty significant. The windows is kind of the most glaring thing about this one that has been changed from its original condition. This property on 10th Street is one of my favorites in the district. It's a very beautiful house. It does have some pretty large additions on the other side of it, but it definitely has retained, a lot of its integrity, and it's a very attractive property. This building along 10th, I believe the subcommittee discussed, was also likely associated with the railway, and is one of the few industrial buildings that was identified as potentially historic.
Well, what they've done is they've taken the name off of it. It used to be Sealy, and it was where they kept, because behind Hensel's Hardware, that was Sealy and Titlow's, that was their store. And that's where the feeds were, the feed store and so forth. And this was their warehouse.
Yeah, so definitely some, fun local history associated with this one. So this was an interesting one because it's pretty clearly two structures that were merged into one. Jill, is not here, but I remember a comment that she had was, that in itself kind of speaks to an interesting era in local history, constructing a small house, and then when you have a bit more income, your family grows, you add on to it, you see this kind of style throughout the region.
But that's a typical thing. And when you look at the settlement era houses, they have wings. So the wing is they have a one-story wing. It's either on the back, the right, or the left, the east or the west, whatever side of it. And they would build those first because that's the most they could afford. And then when they had some additional money, they would build the two-story part. So then you had so this could be that same concept where this first part was the wing, the first part, and then they built a larger one on it. So, because that was a typical thing that happened in the 1800s.
Yeah, and that's a good point. Yeah, about this isn't necessarily terribly unique for Arcata or Eureka or other places in the region. So this property is across from Portuguese Hall. It was, I believe, associated with a lumber yard, and has been identified. I don't think Susie Van Kirk obviously identified it, but I believe at one point a historic report was completed for this one.
So that one's going to be moved somewhere. The people that have the property and have the business there right now for the landing cables, etc., for Google and whomever else will eventually be in there, are going to have to relocate that. They've been using it as office space and break rooms and so forth when I walk by it or drive by it. And they're looking for someone to move it to their property. So that may happen.
Okay, well, that one's good to keep that in mind. And I believe this is the last one. And so in the Gateway Area Plan, we currently identify this one as potentially historic, but we did have a relatively lengthy conversation about it. It falls outside of the 4 eras of development that we've identified. It is a little bit later, but it is somewhat unique for the area and relatively intact. There isn't really a lot of detail on it. Jill noted the windows are, original and a little bit of added architectural style to the structure, but this one was one that we wanted to kind of dig into as well and see if it should remain on the list or not.
And just a little thought about this one too. I think this is a great example of when we're looking at, historic structures, we're not judging, hey, that's a beautiful building or that is a beautiful building. We're looking to see if it fits the criteria that have been laid out. So I think a lot of people get stuck on the idea, oh, that's an ugly building or something. Why is that eligible or something? Or why is that important? That's a subjective, obviously a very subjective statement. That's what we're trying to avoid.
But you also have, I had someone tell me the other day that it's amazing, like 20 years ago, they hated a certain style of architecture. And then 20 years hence now, they go, oh, I love that. How could I have ever hated it? And so we evolve in our thinking, our knowledge, and our appreciation. And this is definitely the Cooper building. It's definitely a significant structure. Nick Frank had it. He remodeled the inside. The inside was basically artist studios along, well, I would say, well, my daughter-in-law had an artist studio there with 4 friends that were all going to Humboldt State in the art department. And they had rough wooden floors, and it was the whole floor, everything. But then he came in and he redid the upstairs, and he made them into nice little offices, put carpet down and such, and put, doors with side lights and, the kinds of things you would find somewhere else. So the interior is totally changed on the second floor. But the building itself, the envelope is, I would say, very significant, and be ashamed to decide it wasn't.
Mhm. Okay, and I believe that wraps up our list. So it, ultimately was not a huge number of resources. I think we knew that outside of the main neighborhood conservation areas and core development of the city, there likely wouldn't be dozens and dozens, but these are the refined ones that hopefully we'll discuss more at upcoming meetings.
Could I ask for a slight break? I just need to take a minute break, and I'll be right back, okay?
Sure, this is a great stopping point. Thank you, Tim. David, did you have something you wanted to say, or do you want to wait for Tim to get back? I saw you had unmuted.
One of the buildings that I think you're talking about, is that yours, Chris? Is that down by you, or are you further down, Chris Richards?
I'm sorry. Can we just pause the meeting? We don't have a quorum right now.
Okay, I was just going to ask him a question. Thank you.
Yeah, sorry. Hate to be the brown act police over here, I guess.
Well, and I was going to say, David, that perhaps we're moving into a time when it is good to hear from other attendees when Tim returns.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great point, Chair. Thank you.
Mm.
Thanks, Jim.
Okay, so did Bill, do you want to turn it over?
Sure. Yeah. This is a great time for any of the attendees that wish to talk about this subject to raise your hands and share what you may want to say. I think that Alex was directing a question to somebody in particular, and maybe that'd be the place to start.
Okay, I wanted to go back, and I wanted to really identify where Chris Richards' property is. And I want to make sure we showed a yellow house, and we showed another building next to it. Is that yours, Chris?
Alex, no, that the building I'm in was built in 1948. It was one of George Hitt's buildings, and it probably has historical value for reasons you guys haven't identified with this study. But I believe the building you're talking about is probably the one on Rich's Auto Body. Are you talking about the little green building?
Yeah, but then there's a yellow house next to it and another building, and I think it's on the corner of 12th, in the vicinity of 12th and K.
No, my shop's in a big metal building. Like I say, it was constructed in 48, back when the street level was at the same level, and it was the main road through town at that point. But anyway, I know a lot about the history of this particular building. But no, in answer to your question, no, that's not me.
But yours, are you in a Quonset hut?
It's not a Quonset hut. No, it's a redwood framed,
Okay.
corrugated steel. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. I see Cam's on here. So Cam, you know anything about some of these properties? Cameron Appleton?
Hi, Alex.
Hi,
No,
Cam.
I don't really know much about any of them, even the ones right there near our property on 9th and N. But the only thing I was wondering, one thing I was wondering about is I saw that the property on the corner of 11th and K was labeled as the Mirada, and I think it's Miranda.
It's Miranda. It's Miranda.
Yeah.
You're correct about that's how they spell it, Miranda. And they also have the Miranda Farm that's down on oh, what street is that? It's M or something like that. M, and it goes into, because from that farm that they had cattle, and they used to take them underneath the freeway so that there's an actual tunnel or opening underneath the Navy Base Road to take the cows back and forth.
Yeah.
Yeah, I must have left the N off, but yeah, received and understood that it's Miranda.
Otherwise, I think it's a great thing to be identifying these and, giving the property owners the background if they don't have it and the ability to participate and, have their property identified this way.
Thanks, Cam.
Thank you, Alex.
And Renee, I see you're on here. You must have some ideas or comments. I'm sorry I'm calling on all of you because your names are posted here, but no pictures. So I was wondering, Renee, what are your thoughts? And Moonlight has her hand up.
Chair, did you?
Yeah. I was going to say, does Bill want to call on either of the participants with their hands raised?
Yes, absolutely. We have any hands raised?
Yeah, I don't know if you can see the order, Bill, but Moonlight raised her hand and then Renee raised her hand.
Well, yes, absolutely. And I do not see that order. So thank you, David. If you've got your hand raised, David can help facilitate the order. Thank you.
Can you hear me? Shall I go ahead?
Yeah, you sound perfect.
Oh, great. I have laryngitis, so I don't know about perfect. I'm just going to tick through a few of my thoughts and notes. First off, I have to start with Alex. We're going to miss you. I know I'm going to miss you. Your expertise and knowledge and your ability to humanize this discussion with chickens and milk deliveries and cows roaming around. So thank you for reminding us about our evolution of thinking, knowledge, and appreciation of structures, and blessings on your new leadership role.
I'm gonna miss you all too, by the way. I just want you to know that. I will definitely miss you all.
Dilo, enjoy Sacramento. I was born and raised there, and great PowerPoint. And so I'm sure hoping that this PowerPoint will somehow magically appear or be uploaded on the YouTube channel for the city under the SERP playlist, like you did for the January meeting. Awesome PowerPoint. And Bill, I'm thrilled that you reviewed the recording from the previous meeting. That is a pretty rare statement to hear from a committee member. And I really appreciated that, especially that these meetings are Zoomed. We have the benefit of not just having audio like we usually did with the in-person, but we have the benefit of the visual for these PowerPoints especially. So that I was very, very pleased to hear you had ascertained that video recording on your own as a extra credits extra credit sticker to you, Bill. And I really am thrilled that the committee is discussing incorporating the social history as possible criteria. I've always thought that was such a cool aspect of this type of discussion, again, with that humanizing aspect. And then let me see, my last thought was just a suggestion. I was hoping that on these types of discussions, especially at these committee levels and even more formal meetings about the Gateway Area Plan, most people don't have the advantage of a printed copy. And so a lot of these chapters are very short that we're discussing. For example, this chapter is about 3 pages in the draft Gateway Area Plan. And, you know, for a person to want to look at what you're referring to, they have to go to the city's website and go to the CERT page and click on and look at the table of contents and then find the page and reference it. So maybe it was included with the committee, agenda reminder, but it sure would be wonderful for the public to have those chapters, especially these really short chapters that we're now discussing. I know mobility is very long, and I know you want to keep the agenda packets somewhat short and contained, but boy, it would just be a wonderful thing to include to help with the visualization for these chapter discussions. So thank you very much, and safe travels home, Dilo, and appreciate the opportunity to share my thoughts, and I sure appreciate all your dedication to all of you, and thank you again.
Thank you, Moonlight. I would say that I particularly needed to review that video in order to prepare for the meeting of the chairs meeting that occurred between our last 2 regular HLC meetings here. So that was the reason I particularly wanted to go back to this committee and make sure I heard what everybody was talking about, represented us with the rest of the chairs at the city council kind of get together a few weeks back. Thank you though, Moonlight. And I suppose Renee's up next.
Renee, go ahead.
Oops, sorry, trying. Serge and I are here, and we own one of the Devlin cottages. I think this is probably a big question and maybe not appropriate for right now, but I would like to know a little bit more about why someone would list their property as a historic building and what the pros and cons are about that.
It's a great question.
Alex probably knows.
You mean why somebody listed it?
Right, like within ours, Patricia and Jim have listed theirs.
That's
maybe
right.
because they were going to build the restaurant. But what's the incentive for the rest of us? The pros and cons for listing or not? And is this list being generated partly so that demolition can't happen to historic structures?
Well, when we first did the survey in the 1980s, when it was complete, I think 1980 or 81. Susie Van Kirk worked on that in the late 70s.
Right.
People were really excited to have their places listed or have historic. They were proud. There was a lot of pride.
Mhm.
And I would hope that people still have pride in having these historic structures, and that you all do with yours that you have down there. And yes, if you wanted to tear it down and you're listed, you'd have to come before this committee and talk about it, why you'd want to tear it down. Which one do you own? Do you own the one on the corner that used to be the barber shop?
No, Alex, you know, the next one that I just painted, that fancy door.
Oh, I saw that door. It looks so good.
Felter sent it to you, yes.
Good, I saw that. I thought it was cool.
Well, within that vein, I think that's my largest concern about this whole project is because there is that block that's rather historically significant, that what's going to happen across the street from it seems ever more important to have it blend in to that and consider that.
Well, nobody knows what the owners of that property are going to do. So
yes, right. I wondered about that too.
And that's been, sometimes you have those great big blue, I don't know, containers that are parked out there, and I don't know. I haven't been by to look to see if they're still there, but I don't know. One day it's a block, and one day someone may decide to do something, and there's ways they could do it, and they can step things back and build houses across from it, there's a lot of ways to make things compatible in the neighborhood when you have that.
Exactly, and I appreciate that point of view. I would like to see that happen. I agree.
So I think those are, and when you're looking at form-based codes, that's one of the things they actually take into consideration is what they have around them.
Mhm. Thank you. Thanks,
Yeah.
Alex.
You're welcome. And I'm glad to know who owns that one. I guess I should remember that from what Bob Felter said.
You'll remember it now.
Yes, I surely will.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So I heard a couple of good suggestions. Perhaps if the committee is interested, we could bring back the next agenda, just a quick little staff report on, listing, why to consider it, what's the difference between being listed and being determined potentially historic under this process, and the pros and cons of, whether you're listed or not being considered potentially historic. I think that's a really good, some information that we need to put out there. And I think to Moonlight's suggestion to, include in the packet the relevant chapters. We've been putting links, but I understand the, complexity of getting to the link. And I think in this packet, we didn't even do that. So we can certainly make that process improvement.
And I wanted to note that Jim was here and he had his hand up and then he disappeared. And I don't know, but he might come back and want to talk at some point. So just.
Yeah, let me see. He keeps popping out of being allowed to talk, and let's see. I do not see him at all anymore.
Boy, if I had his phone number, I'd call him, but I don't.
Of course you would, Alex.
I call him and ask him to come back.
Well, he'll have next meeting. They've been pretty consistent about following this process. So hopefully he'll be back. I don't think anyone else has their hand raised though, Bill.
Okay. I thought, Alex, you might, the question that Renee posed might be a good intro into the Mills Act application for Jacoby Store. Wouldn't that be potentially a positive thing for somebody to seek this kind of designation for their building, and in the hopes that perhaps they would be encouraged to enroll within the Mills Act and be able to spend some of that deferred property tax money on appropriate restoration, repairs, and different kinds of jobs that might be done on a.
You're absolutely right. And I'm sorry I didn't talk about that. But that is something, Renee, you could think about. If you wanted to designate your building, you wanted to think about the Mills Act. The Mills Act can freeze your property tax at whatever it is for 10 years. And then you can use the money each year that you don't pay in property tax to maybe restore all your sills on your house, or to paint your house over a couple of years, or whatever it might be. And it's renewable for another 10 years. It goes through the city process. So you would have to be designated through the city, and then you would have the Mills Act would get approved. And so the Jacoby Storehouse is doing that right now. And that's why it will be announced on this agenda. And they'll be coming back next month to go start the process with HLA, and then they'll go to the Planning Commission and the council for approval. And they're planning on doing, they figure they can't dink it around, but as a homeowner or a small property, you can. They figure they're going to have to get into major work on the back of the building, and that's going to take a significant amount of money, and they couldn't possibly do it in stages over 10 years because it's so massive, the work that needs to be done right there now. But it's something to consider, is the Mills Act for sure. And the Chapman House used the Mills Act. So we only have 2 Mills Act projects in Arcata at the moment. But you may want to look into that, Renee. And your properties on either side of you could too. And it's also that Jim could do that too. He could come into the Mills Act.
Yeah, so it freezes it where it is right now.
As soon as you get approval through the city of Arcata, then, and then it goes to the assessors. I believe that's where you take it. Then it gets frozen at whatever that is. So the longer you wait, the higher the property tax goes.
Right, and then I also wonder about selling and how that works for new folks.
No problem, no problem.
It would just keep going.
Yep, it would.
Okay. Well,
Can I jump in just real quick here? As a point of order, Jim and Patricia, they're keep popping off of the meeting for some reason. And they just got back, so I want to see if they have if they would like to speak while they're able to.
Patricia, this is your moment.
Yeah.
You want to raise your hands?
Oh, there's Jim too. Okay.
They're both,
okay.
And Jim's hands up.
Hello.
Hello, we can hear you.
Maybe they keep popping off because the internet connection at their historic home is just not very good today.
Okay, how about now?
Okay, we can hear you a little better. Go ahead.
Yeah, so quickly, we're on the road, and that's why we've been kind of going off and on. And fortunately, I'm not the one driving. If you can hear me, the one thing I was going to comment on was the survey. I actually did some walking around the gateway and took photos of a number of the houses, and then the ones that you put up came up, and I was just curious if you would be interested in looking at any of the other photos, because it was kind of exciting that we're on the same page on some things. Just to share them for no other reason other than that. Is this thing on? Yeah.
I'm not sure I understand.
Oh no, David, it was just that I walked through and took some photos, and it was just purely to offer some additional resources. And
You took some photos and you'd like to submit them. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, and I realized you guys are pretty far along in the process, and it was more just as a resource.
Yeah, please.
So you can email them to us, to David and or myself, and then we can forward them on to the committee members before the next meeting.
Yeah, and I do realize that a lot of folks will be making their own decisions for their houses, but I thought just based on some of the decisions you're making and the styles of architecture, as taking pictures of it, might be worthwhile if something wanted to look at anything in additional was the only reason. Appreciate the time. Thank you.
Thanks, Jim.
Yeah, no, that'd be great. And I also want to mention that, when we're getting into the form-based code design engagement, having folks think about how, the existing structures and the architectural features of the existing structures might be reflected in new structures. That's something of interest to think about as well. And you could see that replicated in the district and some of the new buildings. Some of the buildings Cash is designed, for example, borrow elements from the Creamery building and other buildings. So just thought I'd throw that out there.
So I'm just going to add one more thing. I'm going to say, Renee, what would be worthwhile is if your neighbors on either side of your house are interested in coming in and doing, because you're all very similar with all your details and your age, etc., to all come in at once as a landmark, and then do one application, because you and share the cost if that's possible, and then you could all do the Mills Act.
Right, you didn't say that was called. Potentially, Alex, sure. I think one of the owners of the property lives in another country. We'll see. Thanks.
You're welcome. You can always call me.
Thanks, Alex.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks for joining us tonight, Renee.
I think Renee brings a really good question forward that is really relevant to this committee and what we do on a monthly basis, and for the rest of the people here today. So I appreciate that question, Renee, and thanks, Alex, for addressing that.
Well, thank you for bringing it up.
have any last speakers here from our attendees today?
Doesn't look like it. So if anyone would like to speak, please raise your hand or forever hold your peace.
At least for another month.
Yes, exactly. Not forever. But no, nobody else has raised their hand. So I think that is it.
Okay. Okay. So I guess we should move on. And Tim, was it correct you're departing here in a few minutes?
Yes, I was hoping to get out about 5:30. If it goes a few minutes past, it's no big deal. So.
Okay, well, we can move on quickly. New business is, I see nothing under new business. So I suppose we should move to the committee and staff communications. And it appears as though we have some sort of information about Jacoby Storehouse.
Yeah, so this can easily just take 90 seconds. So I think we can stay on schedule here. And Alex did speak to it briefly, but I just wanted to give the committee a heads up that the Jacoby Storehouse has submitted a Mills Act application. We likely will be able to bring it the next meeting or the meeting after, depending on where we're at with all of the pieces of the application. But it would be to conduct some, pretty significant facade improvements, significant in the sense of cost. It would not necessarily change, much at all about the exterior. There is also an active and simmering application for potentially a rooftop bar for the structure. We're going to dig a little bit more into that and try and bring back some more information on that as well, just so you can have the full picture of the, holistic developments and past of the structure when you're making the decision. And that is basically what I wanted to say about it. Just wanted to preview that that's coming up. So if you have any questions, we'll be happy to try and get those answered in the next month. Otherwise, I think that was all I had for you.
Thanks, Dilo. That sounds exciting. And hopefully our committee can help the council making decisions they may need to make on that or participate in this kind of a project.
Mm-hmm.
I suppose that I should share that I did attend the what I think of as the meeting of the chairs, where the 11 or so committees for the city, the chair people for each of those committees met a few weeks back at the chambers there at the city hall, and I participated and represented our committee. It went very well, I thought. I think our committee was well received, and I tried to plug the kinds of things that we do every month and the kinds of values that we are trying to bring to the decision makers at the city, and to express our interest in historic preservation and the benefits that brings. The council seemed to appreciate our committee. One of the council members, in fact, upon closing, said that she wanted to go for a walk of town and learn more about the historical buildings. And I thought that was a nice thing for her to say to us in front of the rest of the committee chairs. I was struck by the high level of participants that are representing all the various committees. I recognized many of the chair people, women and men, and felt just on a personal level felt honored to be included amongst that round table of all of us. And but yet I did say during that meeting that our committee is only as good as all of our members. And Tim and Alex, and David and Dilo, I do feel that way. That I think our committee is basically rock stars, and I'm proud to have represented us in that way. And so thanks for the committee for trusting me to do that. And I think it went well. So I wanted to make sure I recorded on that.
Thanks for the kind words there, Bill. We appreciate it.
Yeah, and thanks for your time, preparing for that and attending and speaking on behalf of the committee. I think you did a really excellent job.
Yeah, I attended that meeting as well, and Bill was very generous with his words about the committee. So yeah, thanks for that, Bill.
Well, what I say is true, and I also made sure to say that the committee members are important, but also the public that attends our meeting are important to us as a committee. And so, thank you to the various people who've attended this month at this meeting tonight. And your attendance is important to us and makes us a better committee. So thanks to everybody that attended today. And I suppose with that, we should adjourn.
I think so. What a positive note to adjourn on this evening. Thank you, Bill. So
All right.
meeting's adjourned at 5:33.
Thanks all.
Thank you. Good night.
Thank you, everybody. Good meeting.